My name is Annabella George. I'm 32 years old and a former pediatric physical therapist. For 6 years, I lived with a guilt so heavy it hurt more than my shattered vertebrae. I believed my broken spine was bankrupting my parents. I thought the cost of my medications, my physical therapy, and my existence was bleeding them dry. That is the story they fed me every single day as I lived in their drafty converted garage in San Diego on a $50 a week allowance. They sighed over grocery bills. They rubbed their temples when the mail arrived. They made sure I knew exactly how much my survival was costing them. Then last Tuesday, I sat across from a county caseworker named Brenda. I was secretly applying for a low-income housing voucher, hoping to finally relieve my parents of their burden. Brenda was a veteran of the system. She was a woman with sharp eyes who had seen every type of tragedy, and she did not smile easily. She asked for my financial records. I told her I did not have any because my parents managed everything. She typed my Social Security number into her federal database. I listened to the rhythmic clicking of her keyboard over the hum of the office air conditioner. The smell of stale coffee and printer toner hung in the air. Her fingers suddenly stopped. Her posture stiffened. She leaned closer to the screen as if she misread the data. She looked up at me, and the sheer pity in her eyes made the breath leave my lungs. Brenda turned her monitor around so I could see it. She pointed her pen at a bold green number at the bottom of a federal ledger, $275,000. It took her exactly 4 minutes to shatter 6 years of calculated gaslighting. I was not their financial burden. I was funding their retirement. Every single month, they had been cashing my maximum tier disability checks. My hands started to shake. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed to hum louder. Before I tell you how I dragged my family into federal court and took the very roof over their heads, please take a moment to like and subscribe to Sophia Told Stories. But only do it if this story truly resonates with you. Also drop your age and what state you are watching from in the comments. Now let me take you back to a rainy Tuesday morning on the Interstate 5, where my independence was stolen for the very first time. The memories of the multi-car pileup are not a continuous movie. They are fractured snapshots. The smell of burning rubber filling the cabin of my sedan. The sickening crunch of metal collapsing inward. The cold, rigid pressure of the halo brace they screwed into my skull at the trauma center. I woke up in a sterile hospital room, unable to feel my legs. The doctors told me my spinal cord was severely compressed. My career of helping disabled children walk again was over. I was now the patient. My mother, Susan, sat by my bedside. She brushed my hair with gentle strokes, whispering that everything would be okay. My father, Richard, paced the room holding stacks of medical paperwork. He wore his tailored suit and spoke in that commanding, authoritative voice he used for everything. He told me not to worry about the hospital bills or the insurance claims. He told me to just focus on surviving. I was prescribed heavy doses of neuropathic painkillers, gabapentin, severe muscle relaxers that turned my blood to lead. The drugs cast a thick gray fog over my brain. Days bled into nights. Sentences trailed off in my mind before I could finish speaking them. When I tried to read the discharge papers, the words swam on the page. That is when Richard placed a clipboard on my lap. He handed me a pen. His hand covered mine, steadying my trembling fingers. He said it was just a standard form to let him and Mom handle the Social Security Administration on my behalf while I healed. A representative payee form. He promised they would take care of the bureaucracy so I could focus on getting out of the wheelchair. I signed it. I gave them the keys to my life because I trusted the people who raised me. Over the next few years, whenever I tried to wean myself off the heavy painkillers, Susan would intervene. She would hand me the little orange pill bottles and a glass of water. She would stroke my cheek and tell me I was pushing myself too hard. She said my body needed the rest. I did not realize then that she was not nursing me. She was keeping me docile. My brain stayed in that chemical fog. I stayed compliant. I stayed quiet in the garage, accepting my tiny allowance and wearing sweatpants with worn-out elastic. The garage was drafty in the winter and stifling in the summer. The concrete floor leached the cold right up into my aching joints. Richard would stand in the doorway holding a calculator. He would list the cost of electricity, the cost of my physical therapy copays, the cost of the extra water I used for hot showers to soothe my back. He would sigh and look at me with exhaustion in his eyes. "We are tapping into our retirement for you, Anna," he would say. But that is what families do. I swallowed my pride and thanked them for their sacrifice while I ate generic canned soup and watched them order takeout from high-end bistros. Back in the county office, Brenda pulled my eyes away from the bright screen. She reached over and placed her warm hand over my cold one. The fog was gone now. My mind was sharp. I had spent the last 8 months secretly and painfully tapering off the muscle relaxers. The physical ache in my back was a constant burning fire, but my thoughts were finally my own. Brenda hit the print button on her keyboard. The machine in the corner roared to life, spitting out page after page of evidence. She did not just hand me a single piece of paper. She handed me a 40-page federal ledger, pages of direct deposits, a $45,000 lump sum of back pay deposited 3 years ago, $3,200 appearing on the 3rd of every single month since the accident. Brenda lowered her voice so the people in the waiting room could not hear. She said, "They did not just mismanage your funds, honey. They funded their lives with your spine." I took the stack of papers and walked out into the California sun. I sat in my modified used car in the parking lot for an hour, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I stared at the numbers on the passenger seat. The crushing guilt I carried for 6 years evaporated. In its place, a cold, calculated rage began to build in my chest. I put the car in drive and headed back to the house to ask my father a very simple question. The drive back to my parents' house in San Diego felt like moving through a different dimension. The coastal sun glared off the windshield of my modified used Honda, but my hands gripping the steering wheel were freezing. For 6 years, I had lived in a manufactured reality. Every traffic light I passed, every palm tree swaying in the ocean breeze, felt like a mockingly vibrant backdrop to the dark psychological trap I had just escaped. To understand the depth of the betrayal sitting on the passenger seat in the form of a 40-page federal ledger, you have to understand the physical prison they built for me. They converted the detached garage for my recovery. They painted the drywall a sterile white and put down a thin area rug, but it was still a garage. The concrete floor leached the damp coastal chill straight through my slippers and up into my shattered lumbar spine. In the winter, a single oscillating space heater would frequently blow the circuit breaker, leaving me in the dark. In the summer, the uninsulated roof turned the room into an oven. I spent most of my days lying flat on a stiff mattress, listening to the distant hum of my parents' central air conditioning from the main house. My survival was strictly budgeted. Every Sunday morning, Richard would walk into the garage holding a crisp $50 bill. He would hand it to me with a tight smile. That was my weekly allowance for anything beyond basic generic groceries and my heavy prescriptions. $50 in Southern California buys practically nothing. It might cover a few cheap toiletries, a paperback book to pass the endless hours, or a single modest lunch if I dared to leave the property. It meant I could not afford a rideshare to visit my old friends. It meant I skipped baby showers and birthdays because I could not afford to buy a $15 gift. The poverty kept me isolated, and the isolation kept me silent. My only means of moving around was an aluminum hospital cane Richard brought home from a medical surplus bin. It was a hideous, stark metal stick with a worn-down rubber tip. Every time I placed my weight on it, the cheap joint squeaked. Squeak, squeak, squeak. A constant auditory reminder of my brokenness, echoing across the concrete floor. Before the accident, I spent my days fitting disabled children with state-of-the-art, lightweight, carbon fiber orthotics. I fought insurance companies to get my patients the best mobility aids on the market. Now I limped around my parents' property on a discarded piece of scrap metal, feeling profound gratitude that my father had saved me the expense of buying a new one. The signs were always there. The casual cruelties hidden in plain sight during the rare evenings I joined them for dinner in the main house. I would sit at the oak dining table forcing down a bowl of generic canned chicken noodle soup, while Richard and Susan dined on seared scallops or expensive cuts of steak. They would pour glasses of imported red wine and discuss their day, seemingly forgetting I was sitting right across from them. Susan would sigh, rubbing her temples with her manicured fingers. "The paperwork on these commercial real estate leases is exhausting," she would say, taking a slow sip of her wine. "The tenants are demanding new HVAC systems, and the property management fees are climbing." Richard would nod, slicing his steak with precise, deliberate movements. "Wait until the new property tax hikes hit next quarter. The county assessors are bleeding us dry. We are going to have to restructure the portfolio just to maintain our margins." I would lower my eyes to my soup, feeling a hot wave of shame wash over my face. I naively dismissed their complaints as the standard grievances of wealthy baby boomers managing their retirement investments. Worse, I internalized their stress. I genuinely believed their financial anxieties were the direct result of my expensive medical care draining their savings. I never questioned how they acquired commercial real estate or a sprawling investment portfolio. I simply apologized for eating their food and limped back to the freezing garage on my squeaking cane. The central hub of their operation was located in Richard's home office. It was a room I was rarely allowed to enter. The office smelled of expensive leather and lemon polish. Tucked into the corner behind his heavy mahogany desk was a tall, locking filing cabinet. It was a beautiful piece of dark wood secured by a heavy brass padlock. One afternoon during my 3rd year in the garage, I walked into the house to find a postage stamp. I opened the door to the office and stepped inside. Richard materialized in the hallway behind me almost instantly. His face darkened, and the polite fatherly mask slipped, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. His voice dropped an octave. "You do not need to be in here, Anna." He stepped between me and the mahogany cabinet, blocking my view. He placed a firm hand on my shoulder and physically turned me toward the door. "Just boring tax stuff in there, nothing you need to stress your fragile mind over. Let me carry the heavy logistical burdens. You just focus on resting your back." He locked the office door the moment I stepped into the hallway. I thought of that locked mahogany cabinet as I merged onto the highway, clutching the steering wheel. The pieces of the puzzle clicked together with terrifying clarity, fueled by the conversation I just had with Brenda in the county office. Before I left her desk, I had asked Brenda the one question burning a hole in my chest. How did he get away with it? The Social Security Administration does not just blindly deposit $250,000 into a payee account without any oversight. The federal government demands accountability. Brenda had adjusted her glasses and pulled up a different screen on her monitor. "The government requires an annual representative payee accounting report," she explained. Her gravelly voice carried a heavy dose of disgust. "Every October, your father was required by federal law to submit a detailed ledger showing exactly how your disability funds were spent, how much went to rent, how much went to specialized medical care, how much went to food and personal needs." She turned the screen to face me again. It displayed a digitized copy of a federal form. Richard had filled out the columns with fabricated numbers. He claimed he spent $400 a month on specialized aquatic therapy I never received. He claimed $800 a month went to a custom dietary plan that actually consisted of discount canned goods. He claimed he charged me $1,000 a month in rent to live in an uninsulated garage. But the fabricated numbers were not the most chilling part. Brenda scrolled to the very bottom of the 4th page. Right next to the date was a signature. "He did not just divert the funds," Brenda said quietly. "He submitted sworn federal documents. He committed perjury every 12 months. And look at the signature line, honey." I stared at the screen. The signature was a perfect cursive loop. It was my name. It was my handwriting. He had likely traced it from the old medical consent forms I signed in the hospital while high on neuropathic painkillers. Richard had systematically forged my signature every year for 6 years to keep the federal government blind to his scheme. This was not a passive crime of opportunity. This was an annual, premeditated, calculated operation requiring deep planning and flawless execution. He kept me drugged. He housed me in a damp box. He gave me a broken cane and played the weary martyr while meticulously orchestrating a 6-figure federal fraud. I pulled my car onto the familiar, tree-lined street of my parents' neighborhood. The sprawling houses sat far back from the road, surrounded by manicured lawns and pristine flower beds. I parked across the street from their driveway. Through the living room window, I could see Richard and Susan sitting on their expensive leather sofa, laughing at something on the television. I turned off the engine. The silence in the car was heavy. I picked up the thick manila envelope containing the 40 pages of federal ledgers. I reached over to the passenger floorboard and grabbed the aluminum hospital cane. I stepped out onto the asphalt. The cane squeaked against the ground, but this time, the sound did not make me feel fragile. It sounded like a countdown. I walked toward the front door, ready to show my father that my fragile mind was finally clear. I parked the car and walked up the paved driveway. My aluminum cane hit the concrete with that familiar squeaking sound, but my grip on the handle was like a vice. I did not go to the cinder block garage. I walked straight through the side gate leading to the backyard patio. The evening air carried the scent of night-blooming jasmine and expensive grilled cedar. Richard and Susan were sitting under the wooden pergola. A bottle of premium Napa Valley Cabernet sat open on the glass table between them. My mother held a crystal goblet, tracing the rim with a manicured finger. The setting sun cast long golden shadows across the pristine landscaping. I stepped onto the paving stones. Richard looked up, his brow furrowed in mild annoyance, as if I had interrupted a crucial board meeting. He opened his mouth to ask why I was not in my room resting my back. I did not let him speak. I tossed the thick manila envelope onto the glass table. It landed with a heavy thud, knocking over a small porcelain bowl of mixed nuts. "Read it," I said. My voice was steady. It did not tremble. Richard glanced at the envelope and then at me. He picked it up slowly, pulling out the top few pages. I watched his eyes scan the federal logos, the columns of direct deposits, the unmistakable total of $275,000. I waited for the panic. I waited for the guilt. Instead, I witnessed a master class in manipulation. Richard did not flinch. He set the papers down and smoothed his silk tie. He let out a long, weary sigh and crossed his legs. He looked at me with the exact expression of a disappointed teacher correcting a very slow student. "Anna," he said, his tone dripping with practiced patience, "do you honestly think we would steal from our own daughter?" Susan gasped, placing a hand over her heart. She let a single, perfectly timed tear roll down her cheek. "How could you even think such a thing?" she whimpered, dabbing her eyes with a linen napkin. "We gave up our best years for you." Richard leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He tapped the federal ledger with his index finger. "This money is not stolen, Anna. It is protected. If the government handed a disabled, heavily medicated woman that kind of cash, you would lose your benefits. You would be disqualified from housing vouchers and medical subsidies. I set up an irrevocable special needs trust the month after your accident. The funds are locked in a heavily regulated account meant strictly for your long-term survival. I am the trustee. I cannot touch it, and neither can you. It is for your future." I stood there, feeling the coastal breeze chill the sweat on my neck. The legal jargon sounded so plausible. An irrevocable special needs trust. It was the perfect shield, a sophisticated financial vehicle designed to protect vulnerable adults from exploitation. For a split second, the old conditioning flared up. The dutiful daughter, who wanted to believe her parents were heroes, almost apologized. The authoritative tone Richard used was designed to make me feel small and confused. But the image of Brenda the caseworker staring at her computer screen anchored me. I did not argue. I turned around and walked away, letting my cane squeak against the stones. I retreated to the garage and opened my cheap laptop. The internet connection barely reached my walls, but it was enough. For the next 3 days, I barely slept. The physical toll of sitting in a rigid chair sent burning spasms up my damaged spine, but I ignored the pain. I researched California probate law, fiduciary duties, and federal disability guidelines. I learned that an irrevocable special needs trust requires a formal legal charter filed with the state. It requires a distinct tax identification number separate from a personal Social Security number. Most importantly, it requires annual reporting to the beneficiary. I called a free legal aid clinic pretending to be a law student asking about public records. The paralegal on the phone confirmed my suspicions. If a trust existed attached to my name or my assets, there would be a digital footprint, a tax record, a banking charter. I searched county databases and state registries. I cross-referenced every address and maiden name associated with my family. There was nothing. The trust was a ghost. It was a fabrication designed to make me feel foolish for questioning their authority. The realization did not bring tears. It brought a profound, searing clarity. The sorrow burned away, leaving only cold, iron resolve. They had played me for a fool one last time. Friday evening arrived. Susan had spent all afternoon complaining about a charity dinner they were obligated to attend in Del Mar. I watched from the small window of the garage as they climbed into Richard's leased luxury SUV. The taillights faded down the street, leaving the property silent. I waited exactly 15 minutes to ensure they had merged onto the highway. Then I walked out of the garage and entered the main house through the laundry room door. The house felt enormous and hollow. I bypassed the kitchen and walked straight down the hallway toward Richard's office. The door was unlocked. The room smelled of that same lemon polish and expensive leather. In the corner stood the heavy mahogany filing cabinet. The brass padlock gleamed in the dim light of the desk lamp. He had told me it held boring tax stuff. He had physically blocked me from looking at it years ago. I left the office and walked to the living room fireplace. A heavy wrought iron tool set sat on the brick hearth. I picked up the fire poker. It was thick, solid iron and surprisingly heavy in my grip. I carried it back down the hallway, dragging the tip slightly against the carpet. I stood in front of the mahogany cabinet. I did not hesitate. I swung the iron poker upward, smashing the hooked end directly into the brass padlock. Metal cracked against metal, echoing like a gunshot in the empty house. The lock held. I swung again, gripping the iron rod with both hands, putting the full weight of my uninjured shoulders into the strike. The wood around the hasp splintered. On the fourth strike, the metal bracket tore free from the mahogany drawer. The lock tumbled to the floor. I dropped the poker and pulled the top drawer open. The meticulous organization was staggering. Row after row of color-coded manila folders lined the tracks. I bypassed the folders labeled with rental properties and stock portfolios. I dragged my fingers across the tabs until I found a thick section labeled with my full name. I pulled the folders out and dumped them onto Richard's leather desk. The evidence was overwhelming. Here were the original sealed envelopes from the Social Security Administration, intercepted before they ever reached the garage. Here were the forged annual accounting reports Brenda had shown me on her screen, printed in high resolution. But the most damning evidence lay in the blue folders tucked at the very back. Bank statements. Dozens of them. They were not statements for an irrevocable special needs trust. They were statements for a standard joint checking account under Richard and Susan's names. I traced the columns with my index finger. I saw the direct deposits from the federal government landing on the 3rd of every month. I saw where the money went immediately after. The funds were not sitting in a protective vault. They were bleeding out in large, recurring transfers. There were routing numbers pushing thousands of dollars into a separate account, an account that did not belong to my parents. The ledger showed a regular $2,000 wire transfer categorized under a vague label. I stared at the destination name on the wire transfer receipt, and my blood ran ice cold. The money was not just funding my parents' retirement. It was funding someone else entirely. It was funding the golden child. I packed a single duffel bag that night. I took my cheap, generic medications, my squeaking aluminum cane, and the blue folders containing the joint checking account statements. I left the garage key on the thin mattress and walked out into the cool San Diego night. I called my friend Sarah, who had a small apartment downtown. She did not ask questions when I showed up on her doorstep at 2 a.m. She just pointed to the couch and handed me a blanket. For the next 3 days, that couch became my war room. The physical pain in my spine was a dull, constant roar without my expensive physical therapy. But I funneled the agony into pure focus. I laid the blue bank statements across Sarah's coffee table. I opened my laptop and began the meticulous, sickening process of cross-referencing the withdrawal dates with my parents' public social media accounts. The timeline was a masterpiece of financial predation. On October 14th, 3 years ago, the ledger showed a $15,000 withdrawal labeled medical equipment purchase. I clicked over to Susan's Facebook page and scrolled back to that exact week. There were dozens of photos, Susan and Richard standing in front of the Duomo in Florence. Susan holding up a glass of Chianti in a sun-drenched vineyard. Richard smiling broadly next to a rented sports car on the Amalfi Coast. They had spent 3 weeks in Tuscany, sipping wine and eating handmade pasta, while I lay on a mattress in their garage, staring at the ceiling and apologizing for the electric bill. But the Tuscany trip was just a fraction of the theft. The true sickness of the operation revealed itself in the recurring monthly wire transfers. $2,000 every single month on the 15th. The category listed in the ledger was caregiver expenses. I traced the routing number on the wire transfer. It belonged to an account held by my younger sister, Jessica. Jessica was the golden child, the daughter who did not have a broken spine, the daughter who played varsity tennis, went to a private liberal arts college, and always wore designer clothes. During the 6 years I lived in the garage, Jessica visited me exactly 4 times. She would stand in the doorway holding a customized iced coffee, tell me how brave I was, and leave after 10 minutes complaining about the draft. She never once changed my bandages. She never once helped me navigate the complicated insurance phone trees. She never once acted as a caregiver. Yet every month for 6 years, my federal disability funds deposited a $2,000 stipend directly into her checking account. And then I found the crown jewel of the fraud. 4 years ago, my initial SSDI claim was finally approved, resulting in a massive $45,000 lump sum back pay deposit. The ledger showed that the entire $45,000 was transferred out of the payee account 48 hours after it cleared. I searched Jessica's Instagram. 3 years and 10 months ago, she posted a polished, high-resolution photo of herself, holding a pair of oversized scissors, cutting a red ribbon. Behind her was a sleek, minimalist storefront with frosted glass windows. Core alignment, she had captioned the post. So blessed to finally open my dream Pilates studio in La Jolla. Thank you to my amazing parents for believing in my vision and investing in my future. My stomach dropped. I tasted bile in the back of my throat. I stared at the photo of Jessica, smiling radiantly, standing in front of imported reformer machines and marble countertops. My broken vertebrae had paid for that marble. My shattered independence had purchased those reformers. My parents did not just fund their own retirement. They had used my tragedy to buy the golden child a turnkey luxury business. I closed the laptop. The quiet rage that had been simmering in my chest since the county office calcified into something cold and unbreakable. I did not cry. I did not scream. I put on my best shirt, a faded blue button-down that no longer fit quite right. I grabbed my squeaking aluminum cane and told Sarah I needed to borrow her car for a few hours. The drive to La Jolla took 30 minutes. The coastal fog burned off, revealing a pristine blue sky. I parked across the street from Core Alignment. The studio was exactly as it appeared on Instagram, sleek, intimidating, and dripping with exclusivity. Women in designer athletic wear walked out holding $15 green juices, chatting about their weekends. I crossed the street, my cane squeaking against the pavement. I pushed open the heavy glass door. The air conditioning was crisp, carrying the faint scent of eucalyptus and expensive citrus cleaner. Jessica was standing behind the front desk. The counter was white marble, smooth and flawless. She was typing on a tablet wearing a tailored athletic set that likely cost more than my monthly food budget. She looked up when the door chimed. Her customer service smile froze. "Anna," she said, her voice dropping a register, "what are you doing here? You should not be driving." I walked up to the marble counter. I did not lean on it. I stood as straight as my damaged spine allowed. I reached into my bag, pulled out a copy of the wire transfer receipt, and placed it gently on the pristine white stone. $2,000 a month for caregiver expenses, I said, keeping my voice low and even, plus a $45,000 lump sum capital injection exactly 3 weeks before you signed the commercial lease on this space. Jessica stared at the piece of paper. She did not reach for it. She looked around the empty lobby, checking to see if any clients were within earshot. Her sweet, concerned sister facade melted away, revealing the same calculating coldness I had seen in Richard. She folded her arms across her chest and leaned forward. "You are crazy, Anna," she whispered. "Dad manages the family portfolio. He invested in my business." I tapped the paper. "That routing number is a federal payee account, Jessica. It is not a family portfolio. It is my disability money. You built this entire place on my broken back." Jessica let out a short, bitter laugh. She picked up the receipt and crumpled it into a ball, tossing it into the small wastebasket behind the desk. "Let us be realistic, Anna," she said, her eyes narrowing. "What were you going to do with that money? Buy a nicer wheelchair? Hire a fancier physical therapist to tell you that you will never walk normally again? Dad made a smart investment. I actually built a future. I created something tangible. You are a dependent. You are lucky they even let you stay in the garage." The sheer cruelty of the statement hung in the eucalyptus-scented air. There was no denial. There was no guilt. She felt entirely entitled to cannibalize my life because she viewed me as a depreciating asset. I looked around the beautiful, bright studio. I looked at the imported machines and the high-end retail display. I did not feel the crushing inferiority they had trained me to feel. I felt the profound power of knowing exactly what they had done. "Federal funds are not a family piggy bank, Jessica," I said, turning toward the door. "Enjoy the marble while you can." I walked out of core alignment and let the heavy glass door swing shut behind me. The lines were drawn. My entire family was complicit. There was no salvaging these relationships. They were parasites, and I was done being the host. I sat in Sarah's car and pulled out my phone, searching for a very specific type of attorney. I needed someone who specialized in federal fraud. But before I could make the call, my phone buzzed with an incoming text from Susan. It was an invitation to an upcoming family event that would give me the perfect stage to burn their kingdom to the ground. The drive back from La Jolla was a blur of coastal highway and blinding afternoon sun. I parked Sarah's car a few blocks from her apartment building and turned off the ignition. The silence of the cabin was deafening. Up until this point, the adrenaline had kept me moving. The shock of the theft, the confrontation with Jessica, the sheer audacity of my parents' scheme had fueled a frantic forward momentum. But sitting in the driver's seat, staring at a cracked dashboard, the adrenaline finally burned out. In its place came the pain. It started as a dull ache at the base of my spine, radiating outward like a slow-burning fuse. Without the expensive physical therapy, my muscles were tightening, pulling the damaged vertebrae into unnatural alignments. My legs felt heavy and numb. I gripped the steering wheel and rested my forehead against the cool plastic. I closed my eyes and let the reality of my situation wash over me. I was homeless. I was disabled. I was broke. The people who were supposed to protect me had systematically dismantled my life for profit. I let out a choked sob. The tears came hot and fast, blurring my vision and stinging my cheeks. I felt utterly broken. For 10 minutes I sat there, weeping, feeling smaller and more fragile than I ever had in the garage. I was the victim, the helpless daughter who had been duped. But then the tears began to slow. The rhythm of my breathing steadied. A memory surfaced unbidden, piercing through the heavy blanket of despair. I remembered a cramped hospital room 5 years ago, before the accident. I was wearing my blue scrubs, holding a pediatric gait belt. Standing in front of me was a 7-year-old boy named Leo. Leo had cerebral palsy, and his parents had missed his last 3 physical therapy appointments. When they finally showed up, they complained about the hassle of driving across town. They talked about how expensive his braces were, acting as though Leo was an inconvenience rather than a child who needed intervention. I remembered the fierce protective heat that rose in my chest that day. I did not back down. I pulled the parents into the hallway and explained in precise, uncompromising terms what would happen to Leo's muscles if they neglected his therapy. I threatened to call Child Protective Services if they missed another session. I fought for that little boy with every ounce of professional tenacity I possessed. I did not let anyone treat my patients as burdens. I lifted my head from the steering wheel and wiped my face with the back of my hand. The image of Leo fading into the background of my mind left behind a sharp, resonant truth. I was not just a victim. I was a fighter. I had spent my entire career advocating for the vulnerable, and now it was time to advocate for myself. I reached for my phone and typed a search query into the browser. Disability Fraud Attorney Pro Bono, San Diego. An hour later, I sat in a cramped office that smelled faintly of stale coffee and old paper. The brass nameplate on the desk read, Marcus Wells. Marcus was a man who looked like he had not slept a full 8 hours in a decade. His tie was loose, his sleeves were rolled up, and his desk was a chaotic landscape of case files and empty mugs. He had a cynical edge, a weariness that suggested he had seen the worst of human nature and was rarely surprised. I laid the 40 pages of federal ledgers, the joint account, bank statements, and the photograph of Jessica's Pilates studio on his desk. I explained everything: the garage, the squeaking cane, the forged annual accounting reports, the Tuscany vacation, the monthly $2,000 transfers. Marcus listened without interrupting, his eyes scanning the documents as I spoke. He did not offer pity or empty platitudes. He leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. They were thorough, he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. Richard covered his tracks well with the federal reporting. He knew exactly how to navigate the system to avoid triggering an audit. But he made a mistake. He got greedy. Funding the commercial lease for your sister's business creates a traceable financial trail. We can prove misappropriation of funds. Marcus picked up a pen and began making notes on a yellow legal pad. But we need more, he continued. We need to prove malicious intent. We need to show that this was not just gross negligence, but a calculated, deliberate scheme to exploit your vulnerability. He tapped the pen against the desk. Let me pull your full medical file from the Social Security Administration. As your representative payee, Richard had access to all correspondence regarding your medical evaluations. There might be something in there that solidifies our case. I signed the authorization forms giving Marcus permission to access my federal records. He told me it would take a few days to process the request. I left his office feeling a strange mix of exhaustion and relief. For the first time in 6 years, I was not fighting this battle alone. I had an ally. Someone who understood the complex legal machinery necessary to dismantle my parents' fraudulent empire. 3 days later, my phone rang. It was Marcus. His voice sounded different. The cynical edge was gone, replaced by something tight and controlled. Anna, he said, I need you to come to my office right now. I found something bad. When I walked into his office, Marcus was standing by the window, looking out at the street. He turned as I entered and gestured to a chair. He did not sit down. He picked up a thick file folder from his desk and held it out to me. I pulled the medical records, he explained. The full history of your disability claim, including the ongoing evaluations required to maintain your maximum benefit tier. He paused, running a hand through his hair. Anna, 3 years ago, your primary neurologist submitted a recommendation for a highly specialized, intensive spinal rehabilitation program. It is an experimental treatment covered by Medicare, specifically designed for your type of injury. The clinical trial showed a 60% restoration of mobility in patients who completed the program. I stared at the folder in my hands. 60%. The words echoed in my mind. 60% meant walking without a cane. 60% meant managing my own pain without heavy narcotics. 60% meant a return to a normal life. I looked up at Marcus. Why did I never hear about this? Because Richard declined it, Marcus said, his voice flat. As your representative payee, he had the legal authority to manage your medical decisions. He signed a formal waiver explicitly refusing the treatment on your behalf, stating that you were too fragile to undergo the physical strain of the program. The air in the room grew thick. I struggled to draw a breath. Why would he do that? I whispered, even though the answer was already forming in my mind. A dark, sickening realization. Marcus sat down heavily in his chair. If you recovered Anna, your disability rating would change. If you regained 60% of your mobility, you would no longer qualify for the maximum benefit tier. The $45,000 lump sum back pay, the $3,200 a month, all of it would have stopped or been significantly reduced. He leaned forward, resting his arms on the desk. They traded your physical recovery for cash. They kept you broken so they could keep getting paid. The sheer, monstrous magnitude of the betrayal hit me like a physical blow. The stolen money, the fake trust, the Tuscany vacation, the Pilates studio, all of it paled in comparison to this. They had stolen my chance to heal. They had looked at an opportunity for me to regain my life and decided that a monthly wire transfer was more valuable. The rage that had been simmering within me ignited into a blazing inferno. I looked at Marcus, my hands gripping the edge of the desk. What do we do now? I asked, my voice hard and uncompromising. Marcus offered a predator smile. We go to war, he said. But before we could launch our offensive, Richard and Susan realized I had disappeared, and the federal checks were in jeopardy. They launched a counterattack so ruthless it threatened to strip away the last remaining shreds of my autonomy and lock me in a cage I could never escape. The warning shot did not come through a phone call or a text message. It arrived on a Thursday morning, wrapped in a thick manila envelope. I was sitting on Sarah's faded corduroy sofa, resting my aching spine against a heating pad, when the sharp knock echoed through the small apartment. Sarah was at work. I pulled myself up, relying on the new wooden walking stick I had purchased at a pharmacy to replace the squeaking metal hospital cane. I opened the front door, expecting a delivery driver. A man in a wrinkled gray polo shirt stood on the welcome mat, holding a clipboard. He looked at my face and then down at a photograph clipped to his paperwork. Annabella George, he asked. I nodded. He thrust the heavy envelope into my hands, turned on his heel, and walked down the exterior stairs without another word. I closed the door and leaned against the frame. The envelope felt unnaturally heavy. The return address in the upper left corner featured the embossed logo of a prestigious San Diego family law firm. My pulse quickened. Jessica had clearly called our father the second I walked out of her Pilates studio. Richard knew I had the federal ledgers. He knew the illusion was shattered. This envelope was his response. I carried the package to the kitchen counter and tore the reinforced flap. A stack of thick, premium legal paper slid out, bound by a heavy brass staple. I stared at the bold black font at the very top of the first page. Ex parte petition for appointment of conservator of the person and estate. The air in the kitchen grew thin. A ringing sound started in my ears, drowning out the hum of the refrigerator. I leaned heavily on my wooden stick and forced my eyes to track across the sterile, clinical text. The document was a masterpiece of legal fiction. Richard and Susan were petitioning the California probate court to strip away my basic human rights. According to the sworn affidavits attached to the filing, my severe spinal cord injury had caused profound, traumatic brain damage that went undiagnosed for years. The petition claimed I was suffering from erratic paranoia, delusions of financial persecution, and severe cognitive decline. It stated I had recently fled a safe, stable, caregiving environment and was currently a danger to myself. I turned the pages, my fingers trembling so badly the paper rattled. They had hired a notoriously ruthless attorney to draft this nightmare. I recognized the law firm's name from local billboards. They charged premium hourly rates. A sickening realization hit me like a physical blow. Richard was using my stolen federal back pay to hire the lawyers who were actively trying to enslave me. If a judge granted this emergency petition, my life as an independent citizen would end. A conservatorship meant I could not sign a lease. I could not open a bank account. I could not vote. I could not choose my own doctors or refuse medical treatment. Richard would be granted total legal authority over my physical body and my finances. He could force me back into the drafty garage. He could legally lock me inside and feed me pills until the fog returned permanently. The sheer terror of the threat paralyzed me. This was not a dispute over stolen funds anymore. This was an attempt to erase my legal existence. They realized I was a threat to their luxury lifestyle, and their response was to bury me alive under a mountain of state-sanctioned paperwork. I slid down the front of the kitchen cabinets until I hit the linoleum floor, clutching the petition to my chest. The walls of Sarah's small apartment felt like they were closing in, shrinking into the dimensions of a cinder block garage. I sat on the floor for 20 minutes, fighting the panic, trying to drag oxygen into my lungs. The memory of the waived physical therapy program, the 60% mobility they stole from me, flared in my mind. The terror dissolved into a cold, sharp fury. I refused to go back into the dark. I pulled myself up off the floor, gathered the legal documents, and walked out the door. 40 minutes later, I dropped the thick stack of premium paper onto Marcus Wells' cluttered desk. He was mid-sip of his coffee, but the loud thud made him pause. He lowered his mug and picked up the petition. The cynical weariness in his eyes vanished the moment he read the title. He leaned forward, flipping through the pages with rapid, practiced movements. The silence in his office stretched. The only sound was the rustle of the thick paper and the distant wail of a passing siren outside the window. "This is a scorched earth tactic," Marcus finally said, his voice a low, grim rumble. "Richard knows you found the wire transfers. He knows his federal fraud is exposed. This petition is a preemptive strike to discredit you. If he gets a judge to declare you legally incompetent, everything you say about the stolen money becomes the paranoid rambling of a brain-damaged dependent. The state will silence you before the federal government even hears you speak." I gripped the wooden arms of my chair. "Can he win?" I asked, my voice tight. "Can a judge just take my life away because my father filed a piece of paper?" Marcus tossed the petition back onto his desk. "Family court in California is a meat grinder, Anna. Judges handle dozens of these cases a day. When wealthy, respectable parents walk in with an expensive lawyer claiming their disabled daughter is having a mental breakdown, the court often errs on the side of caution. They grant temporary conservatorships just to maintain the status quo. And once you are in the system, fighting your way out is nearly impossible." I felt the blood drain from my face. "So they win," I whispered. "They steal $250,000, buy my sister a business, decline my medical recovery, and now they get to own me." Marcus let out a short, dark laugh. He picked up his pen and pointed it at the petition. I said, "Family court is a meat grinder. I did not say we are going to let them put you in it. Richard thinks he is playing a local game. He thinks he can use a state judge to sweep a federal crime under the rug. He just made a fatal strategic error." Marcus turned to his computer and began typing rapidly. By filing this petition in state court, Richard and Susan had to submit sworn financial affidavits proving they are capable of managing your estate. They just handed a judge a notarized document listing their income and assets. They put their lies on the official court record under penalty of perjury. He stopped typing and looked at me. His eyes were bright with a predatory intensity. "State perjury is a serious offense. But when it intersects with federal wire fraud, it becomes something beautiful. We are not just going to fight this conservatorship on defense, Anna. We are going on the offensive. Marcus picked up his desk phone. I watched him dial a long number. He held the receiver to his ear and waited. "Who are you calling?" I asked, keeping my voice low. Marcus covered the mouthpiece with his hand. "The local police cannot help us here. They will look at this and call it a civil family dispute. We need a predator much higher up the food chain. We need people who do not care about your father's tailored suits or his expensive local lawyers." A voice answered on the other end of the line. Marcus sat up straight. "Yes, good afternoon," Marcus said, his tone shifting into crisp professional authority. "I need to speak with the special agent in charge. This is Attorney Marcus Wells. I have a client who wants to report a 6-figure wire fraud scheme involving a representative payee. Yes, I have the forged federal accounting ledgers right here." He looked at me and offered a tight, confident nod. "The Office of the Inspector General handles internal fraud for the Social Security Administration. They move quietly, and they carry absolute authority. We are inviting the federal government into your parents' pristine coastal lives." Marcus hung up the phone 10 minutes later. The wheels were in motion. The federal agents were opening a forensic audit based on the documents we provided. But Marcus warned me that the federal gears grind slowly. In the meantime, we still had to survive the state court battle. "Richard has scheduled an emergency hearing for next week," Marcus explained, leaning across the desk. "To beat this petition, you cannot just tell the judge you are sane. We have to prove it medically. Richard's lawyers have already subpoenaed your old, heavily medicated records. They are going to paint you as a fragile, confused addict." He tapped the wooden surface of his desk. "Tomorrow morning, you are walking into a court-mandated, independent neurological evaluation. A doctor you have never met is going to test your memory, your logic, and your sanity. If you fail, Richard owns you forever. If you pass, we trap him in his own perjury. Get some sleep, Anna. Tomorrow, we put your brain on trial." The state court battle for my freedom did not begin with a dramatic speech in front of a judge. It began with an avalanche of medical subpoenas. Richard's premium law firm wasted no time executing their strategy. Within 48 hours of filing the emergency conservatorship petition, they demanded access to my entire medical history. They wanted every chart, every prescription log, and every doctor's note from the past 6 years. They were building a paper trail of incompetence, and they had 6 years of my medicated existence to pull from. Marcus warned me that their legal team would attempt to hand-pick the evaluating physician. They wanted a doctor who was friendly to their firm, someone who would glance at my history of high-dose gabapentin and muscle relaxers and rubber stamp a diagnosis of permanent cognitive impairment. If they succeeded, the battle was over before I even stepped into a courtroom. "We cannot let them choose the referee," Marcus told me, pacing his cramped office. "If Richard brings in his own medical expert, they will paint you as a fragile dependent who needs constant supervision. We have to force the court to appoint an independent, neutral neurologist, a doctor with zero ties to your parents or their expensive lawyers." Marcus filed a counter-motion demanding a court-appointed evaluator. He argued that since Richard was the subject of an ongoing federal fraud investigation, any medical expert chosen by him would present a severe conflict of interest. The family court judge, a stern woman who had likely seen 1,000 bitter family disputes, granted our motion. She appointed Dr. Eris Thorne, a highly respected neurologist known for his rigorous, uncompromising assessments. My evaluation with Dr. Thorne was not a simple interview. It was a grueling 3-day cognitive marathon. I walked into his sterile clinic in downtown San Diego, gripping my wooden walking stick, feeling the familiar burning ache in my lumbar spine. I wore a simple blouse and slacks, determined to project stability. I knew that every word I spoke, every hesitation, every physical wince was being analyzed and documented. Dr. Thorne was a man of few words and intense scrutiny. He did not ask about my feelings or my family dynamics. He asked me to count backward from 100 by sevens. He asked me to recall complex sequences of numbers and shapes. He administered hours of spatial reasoning tests, logic puzzles, and memory recall exercises. He pushed my brain to its absolute limits, testing for any sign of the traumatic brain damage Richard had claimed in his sworn petition. The physical toll of sitting in a rigid chair for hours each day was agonizing. Without the heavy painkillers, the spasms in my back flared with blinding intensity. I wanted to lie down. I wanted to close my eyes and escape the clinical interrogation. But the memory of the waived physical therapy program, the 60% mobility my father had stolen from me, fueled a fierce, unyielding stamina. I did not falter. I answered every question with precision. I leaned into my background as a pediatric physical therapist, utilizing my understanding of anatomy and neurology to articulate my physical condition with medical accuracy. On the third day, Dr. Thorne closed his thick binder and looked at me across his desk. "Miss George," he said, his voice flat and analytical, "the medical records your father submitted show a history of heavy narcotic use. Those medications often mimic the symptoms of cognitive decline. However, my assessment indicates that you possess an exceptional level of cognitive function. Your memory, logic, and spatial reasoning are entirely intact." He tapped his pen against the closed binder. "I will be submitting my report to the court tomorrow morning. I will state unequivocally that there is absolutely no neurological basis for a conservatorship. You are in full possession of your mental faculties." The relief was a physical weight lifting off my shoulders. I thanked Dr. Thorne and walked out of his office feeling a profound sense of vindication. I had survived the medical interrogation. I had proven my sanity. The first pillar of Richard's carefully constructed lie had crumbled. But Marcus reminded me that the victory was only partial. The medical report destroyed their claim of incompetence, but the financial battle still loomed. The conservatorship hearing was scheduled for the following week. Richard and Susan would still take the stand and paint themselves as impoverished martyrs, drained by the cost of my care. They would lie under oath to a state judge, unaware of the federal storm gathering just over the horizon. While I was fighting for my sanity in Dr. Thorne's office, the federal agents at the Office of the Inspector General had not been idle. Marcus received encrypted updates from his contact at the agency. The forensic audit was moving with silent, devastating efficiency. The federal investigators were not looking at medical records. They were following the money. They issued quiet subpoenas to Richard's banks, pulling the transaction histories for the joint checking account he shared with Susan. They tracked the $45,000 lump sum back pay deposit. They traced the recurring $2,000 monthly wire transfers. But federal agents do not stop at bank statements. They dig deeper, mapping the entire financial ecosystem of their targets. They pulled the leasing agreements for Richard's luxury SUVs. They cross-referenced the dates of the vehicle acquisitions with the massive withdrawals from my payee account. They investigated Susan's credit card statements, correlating the charges for premium Napa Valley wine and Tuscan vacations with the influx of federal disability funds. The most crucial part of their investigation, however, centered on commercial real estate. Marcus had warned the agents about Jessica's Pilates studio in La Jolla. The OIG investigators subpoenaed the commercial lease agreement for core alignment. They traced the initial security deposit and the subsequent monthly rent payments directly back to the routing numbers associated with my stolen federal money. The evidence was mounting, transforming a civil family dispute into a robust federal indictment. The agents were documenting a systemic, calculated misappropriation of government funds. Every forged annual accounting report Richard had submitted, every fabricated expense, every luxury purchase was being meticulously logged into a federal database. I sat in Marcus' office reviewing the latest update from the OIG. The scale of the investigation was staggering. My parents had built an empire of comfortable coastal wealth entirely on the foundation of my shattered spine. They had convinced themselves they were untouchable, shielded by their affluent status and their tailored suits. They did not realize that the federal government does not care about local prestige. The federal government only cares about the ledger. "We have the medical clearance," Marcus said, leaning back in his chair and steepling his fingers. "We have proven you are competent. Now we let Richard and Susan walk into that courtroom and commit perjury. We let them swear under oath that they are broke while the federal agents actively freeze their accounts." He smiled a cold, predatory expression. "But the OIG found something else, Anna. Something that turns this from a simple fraud case into a mechanism for total asset seizure. They found where the largest chunk of your money went, and it gives us the legal leverage to take everything they own." The call from Marcus came late on a Tuesday afternoon, just as the coastal fog began to roll in over the San Diego skyline. His voice lacked its usual gruff cadence, replaced instead by a tight, controlled energy. He told me to get to his office immediately. I grabbed my wooden walking stick and navigated the stairs of Sarah's apartment building, my heart pounding a steady rhythm against my ribs. The medical evaluation had secured my sanity, but the financial audit was the weapon that would dismantle my parents' empire. When I arrived, Marcus was not sitting behind his chaotic desk. He was standing in front of a large white board he had dragged into the center of the room. The board was covered in a complex web of dates, routing numbers, and property addresses written in stark black marker. He held a thick file folder marked with the seal of the Office of the Inspector General. "The federal agents finished tracing the money, Anna," he said, turning to face me. "The forensic audit is complete, and the results are devastating." I leaned against the doorframe, gripping the handle of my stick. "How bad is it?" Marcus let out a short, sharp exhale. "It is not just bad. It is a masterpiece of financial hubris. Richard did not just siphon your funds to pay for groceries and vacations. He used your federal disability money to permanently secure his legacy." He walked over to the whiteboard and tapped a specific date with his marker. 2 years ago, your parents paid off the remaining balance on their primary residence, the sprawling 4-bedroom house with the ocean view where you spent 6 years locked in a drafty garage. The final payoff amount was $150,000. He turned to look at me, his eyes locked onto mine. The OIG traced that exact amount. Richard wired it directly from the joint checking account he funded with your SSDI back pay and monthly stipends. He used your broken spine to buy his house outright. The air in the office suddenly felt thick and unbreathable. The sheer scale of the theft was difficult to process. I remembered sitting in that freezing garage, listening to Richard complain about property taxes and mortgage rates, genuinely believing my existence was a financial burden. All the while, he was using my tragedy to ensure he would never have to pay a mortgage again. But Marcus was not finished. He moved his marker to another section of the whiteboard. "And then there is your sister, the golden child." He tapped a series of transactions clustered around a specific month: Core Alignment, the luxury Pilates studio in La Jolla. The OIG pulled the commercial lease agreement and the invoices for the imported reformer machines. The initial security deposit, the first 6 months of rent, and the entire equipment purchase were all funded through a series of direct wire transfers. Marcus dropped the marker and picked up the OIG file. The routing numbers on those wire transfers matched the account Richard used to hoard your funds. Jessica did not secure a small business loan. She did not find outside investors. Your parents bought her that turnkey business, using the money the federal government sent to keep you alive. I sank into the nearest chair, my legs suddenly feeling weak. "They took everything," I whispered. "They left me with nothing while they bought houses and businesses." Marcus slammed the file folder onto his desk, the sound echoing sharply in the quiet office. "No, Anna. That is where you are wrong. They did not leave you with nothing. They actually gave you everything." I looked up, confused. "What do you mean?" Marcus leaned across the desk, a fierce, triumphant grin spreading across his face. "Have you ever heard of a legal concept called a constructive trust?" I shook my head. "A constructive trust is an equitable remedy used by the courts," Marcus explained, his voice vibrating with intensity. "When someone obtains property through fraud, embezzlement, or misappropriation of funds, the law does not allow them to keep it. Instead, the court acts as if the thief was simply holding the property in trust for the rightful owner. He pointed to the whiteboard outlining the mortgage payoff and the Pilates studio funding. Because Richard and Susan used stolen federal funds directly traceable back to your payee account to acquire these specific assets, they do not legally own them. The law dictates that they purchased those assets for you. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The crushing weight of victimization I had carried for 6 years evaporated instantly, replaced by a profound, staggering sense of empowerment. "Are you saying," I asked, my voice trembling slightly, "I am saying," Marcus interrupted, "that you legally own your parents' house. I am saying you own the commercial lease and the equipment for core alignment. The OIG has the irrefutable proof. They did not just steal your money, Anna. They unknowingly built an empire and handed you the keys." I stared at the whiteboard, the web of numbers and dates suddenly looking less like a record of theft and more like a map to my future. The justice of it was so perfect, so poetic, it felt almost surreal. The very assets they purchased with my suffering would be stripped from them and handed back to me. "So what is the next step?" I asked, my voice now steady and resolute. "The U.S. Attorney's Office is preparing to unseal the indictment," Marcus replied. "The charges are severe: wire fraud, misapplication of fiduciary funds, and perjury. The federal government does not take kindly to individuals who exploit vulnerable beneficiaries and lie on federal accounting reports." He walked around the desk and sat down, his demeanor shifting from triumphant to strategic. "The OIG agents are coordinating with the federal prosecutors. They are going to freeze all of Richard's and Susan's accounts, including the business accounts for core alignment. The asset seizure notices are already drafted. But we have a tactical advantage," Marcus continued, leaning forward. "The state court conservatorship hearing is still scheduled for next week. Richard and Susan are going to walk into that courtroom believing they are untouchable. They are going to take the stand and commit perjury under oath, claiming they are financially ruined from caring for you." He smiled a cold, calculating expression. "We let them lie, Anna. We let them dig their grave in state court while the federal agents prepare to drop the hammer. We do not show our hand until the trap is fully sprung." I nodded, feeling a cold knot of anticipation tighten in my stomach. The confrontation was inevitable, and I was ready for it. I was no longer the fragile, heavily medicated daughter hiding in a garage. I was the architect of their destruction, armed with federal indictments and the undeniable truth. "There is one more detail," Marcus said, pulling a printed calendar from his desk drawer. "The timeline for the unsealed indictment aligns perfectly with a significant event." He slid the calendar across the desk, tapping a date circled in red ink. "Next weekend, your sister Jessica is getting married. A massive, lavish wedding at a coastal resort in La Jolla, paid for, I assume, with the last remnants of your drained savings." I looked at the circled date, the memory of Jessica's cruel words echoing in my mind. "You are disabled, Anna. What were you going to do? Buy a nicer wheelchair?" I looked back at Marcus, a slow smile spreading across my face. "Let them have their wedding," I said, my voice hard and uncompromising. "Let them gather all their wealthy friends and celebrate their stolen success. Because when the federal agents arrive, it will not just be an arrest. It will be an eviction." The San Diego Superior Court building was a towering structure of concrete and glass, designed to make you feel small the moment you walked through the revolving doors. The air inside smelled of floor wax, stale coffee, and the distinct metallic scent of nervous sweat. I bypassed the security checkpoint and walked toward the elevators, leaning heavily on the cheap aluminum hospital cane. I had purposefully left my new wooden walking stick at Sarah's apartment. Today, I wore a faded, oversized gray sweater and dark slacks that hung loose on my frame. I needed to look exactly like the broken, fragile dependent my father described in his legal petition. Marcus met me in the hallway outside Department 42. He had orchestrated his own costume for the morning. His tie was slightly crooked, his suit jacket looked slept in, and he carried a battered leather briefcase bursting with loose papers. He looked like an overwhelmed public defender who was entirely out of his depth. "Play the part, Anna," he murmured as we waited for the heavy oak doors to open. "Keep your head down. Let your hands tremble if you can. Do not look angry. Look terrified. Let them believe they hold all the cards." I nodded, gripping the squeaking metal handle of my cane. Down the hall, the elevator chimed. Richard and Susan stepped out, flanked by a man in a pristine charcoal bespoke suit, carrying a sleek carbon fiber briefcase. This was the premium family law attorney they had purchased with my stolen back pay. Richard walked with his shoulders squared, projecting the aura of a weary but noble patriarch. Susan clung to his arm, dabbing at the corners of her eyes with a tissue, even though the hallway was empty. They did not even glance in my direction. We entered the courtroom and took our seats at the respondents' table. The room was lined with dark wood paneling, giving it the heavy, suffocating feel of a cigar box. The judge, a stern woman with sharp features and reading glasses perched low on her nose, took the bench. The bailiff called the docket, and the hearing for the emergency conservatorship began. The expensive attorney stood up and painted a heartbreaking portrait of a tragic family dealing with a severely damaged daughter. He spoke of my spinal injury using highly clinical terms designed to sound devastating. He claimed my physical trauma had triggered latent paranoia, leading me to abandon my safe home and wander the city in a state of delusion. He called his first witness to the stand. Susan walked to the witness box holding her tissue. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. She wore a modest navy dress, but she had forgotten to remove her Cartier watch. It gleamed under the fluorescent courtroom lights, a silent testament to the wealth she was about to deny possessing. Her performance was Oscar-worthy. She described the grueling, sleepless nights she spent nursing me. She talked about the specialized dietary meals she cooked, the constant physical therapy exercises she helped me perform, and the emotional toll of watching her child slip away into madness. "We gave up our golden years for her," Susan said, her voice trembling perfectly on cue. "We drained our retirement accounts to make sure she had the best care possible. And now her mind is so sick, she thinks we are her enemies." I kept my head bowed, letting my hair fall forward to hide my face. I dug my fingernails into my palms to keep from reacting. I remembered the freezing concrete floor of the garage. I remembered the generic canned soup. I remembered the $50 weekly allowance. I let my shoulders shake slightly, playing the part of the weeping, broken daughter. Then Richard took the stand. He did not cry. He projected stoic parental sacrifice. He adjusted his suit jacket and spoke directly to the judge, utilizing that deep, authoritative tone that had controlled my life for 6 decades. The opposing attorney guided him through a series of financial questions designed to prove that I was a massive liability, and they were saints for keeping me out of a state facility. Richard submitted a stack of documents into evidence. I recognized them immediately. They were the forged annual accounting ledgers he had submitted to the Social Security Administration. He was offering fabricated federal documents to a state judge. "The medical bills are insurmountable, Your Honor," Richard said, his face a mask of solemn grief. "Between the out-of-pocket deductibles, the in-home care equipment, and the handicap modifications to our property, we are nearing the brink of personal bankruptcy. We are fighting to keep our home." I only filed this petition because if Anna manages her own minimal finances, she will end up on the street in a matter of days. She simply does not understand the cost of living. I glanced up at the clock mounted on the wood-paneled wall above the jury box. It read 10:30 in the morning. A cold electric thrill ran down my spine. Marcus had briefed me on the precise operational timeline the night before. At this exact second, while my father sat in a wooden chair weeping about his impending foreclosure, the invisible trap was snapping shut across the county. Federal agents from the Office of the Inspector General were walking into 3 different bank branches simultaneously. They were bypassing the tellers and handing heavy, sealed federal warrants directly to the branch managers. The joint checking accounts. The commercial business accounts for core alignment. the personal savings accounts containing my stolen money. Everything was turning to ice. The routing numbers were locking down. The debit cards were deactivating. The dramatic irony was a tangible entity in the room. I was sitting 10 feet away from a man committing perjury, on the public record testifying about his financial ruin, while actively becoming financially ruined in real time. He thought he was outsmarting a local family court judge. He had no idea the federal government was already inside his vault. The opposing attorney finished his direct examination and sat down looking exceedingly pleased with himself. The judge turned her sharp gaze to our table. "Mr. Wells," she said, "do you have any questions for the petitioner?" Marcus stood up, brushing a piece of invisible lint from his rumpled jacket. He fumbled with his legal pad, looking thoroughly intimidated by the pristine lawyer across the aisle. "Just a few points of clarification for the official record, Your Honor." He walked slowly toward the podium. "Mr. George, you testified that your daughter's medical expenses have pushed you to the brink of foreclosure. Is that correct?" "It is," Richard replied, his tone dripping with condescension. Marcus flipped a page on his pad. "So for the official court transcript, you swear under penalty of perjury that the remaining balance of your primary residence mortgage was paid using only your personal, occupational wages and legitimate family savings." Richard did not hesitate. His arrogance shielded him from seeing the trap. "Yes," he said firmly. "And you swear," Marcus continued, not missing a beat, "that you hold no joint accounts containing commingled federal disability funds. You swear you have never utilized Annabella's federal money to finance commercial business ventures for any other family members." The opposing attorney stood up halfway, ready to object to relevance, but Richard waved him off. "The suggestion is absurd," Richard scoffed, looking at Marcus with open disgust. "No, I have never done such a thing. Every penny from the government went to her care." "Thank you, Mr. George," Marcus said. He turned and walked back to our table. "No further questions, Your Honor." The expensive lawyer smiled, leaning back in his leather chair. He thought Marcus had given up. He thought the defense had collapsed under the weight of Richard's pristine testimony. The judge gathered the paperwork on her desk. She looked down at Richard and then over to me. "Given the severe nature of these claims and the conflicting neurological evaluation submitted by Dr. Thorne this morning, I am not prepared to issue a ruling today. This court requires time to review the financial affidavits and the medical addendums. I am delaying the final ruling for 14 days. The temporary orders will remain pending." She struck her gavel and adjourned the hearing. Richard stood up, smoothing his tie. He turned away from the witness stand and locked eyes with me across the courtroom. He did not look like a weeping, grieving father anymore. He offered a slow, chilling smirk. It was the smile of a predator who believed he had just successfully cornered his prey. He thought the 14-day delay was just a bureaucratic formality. He thought he had won. I lowered my eyes and let my hands tremble, gripping the squeaking aluminum cane. I played the terrified victim perfectly as he walked out the heavy oak doors. I did not want to ruin the surprise. Because in exactly 5 days, my sister Jessica was throwing a $100,000 wedding reception at a coastal resort, and I was going to hand-deliver my father the bill. The 14-day delay granted by the state court judge was a ticking clock, but the timeline was not determined by the sluggish pace of the judicial system. It was perfectly synchronized with the social calendar of the San Diego elite. In exactly 5 days, my younger sister Jessica was marrying a junior investment banker named Chad. Chad was the kind of man who wore pastel polo shirts on weekends and belonged to a country club he could not afford. The wedding was projected to cost $100,000. Every floral arrangement, every bottle of vintage champagne, every slice of the tiered fondant cake was funded by the final dregs of my stolen disability account. My phone buzzed against the laminate countertop of Sarah's kitchen. A text message from Susan. I had not blocked her number, knowing that keeping the lines of communication open was crucial to maintaining the illusion of compliance. I looked at the screen. "We know you are confused right now," Anna Susan wrote, her words dripping with manufactured grace. Your father and I forgive you for the outburst in court. Despite everything, we are saving a seat for you at Jessica's reception on Saturday. Family is family." I stared at the glowing letters. Family is family. The phrase was a weapon they wielded whenever they needed to justify their exploitation. It meant unconditional silence. It meant accepting their abuse as a form of love. I did not throw my phone. I did not text back a string of obscenities. I typed a single, simple sentence. "I will be there." I set the phone down and looked at Sarah, who was sitting across the table nursing a cup of tea. She raised an eyebrow. "You are actually going." "I am going," I said, feeling the cold, unyielding resolve settle into my bones. "And I am not going to hide in the back room this time." The preparation for the weekend was meticulous. Marcus had secured a small personal loan for me, drawn against the inevitable restitution I would receive when the federal indictments dropped. It was not a large sum, but it was enough to shed the physical markers of my victimization. For 6 years, my parents had dressed me in baggy, faded sweatpants and oversized shirts, visually reinforcing the narrative that I was a fragile, broken invalid. I walked into a high-end boutique in downtown San Diego. I bypassed the casual racks and walked straight to the formal wear. I selected an evening gown in a deep emerald green. It was tailored sharp and uncompromising. The silk fabric draped elegantly, hiding the slight rigidity of my posture, but accentuating a strength I had forgotten I possessed. When I looked in the dressing room mirror, I did not see the pathetic dependent my father had described to the judge. I saw the fierce pediatric physical therapist who used to fight insurance companies. I saw a woman who was about to dismantle an empire. But the dress was only half of the transformation. I drove to a medical supply store clutching the squeaking aluminum hospital cane Richard had given me. The metal was scratched, the rubber tip worn smooth from dragging across the concrete floor of the garage. I walked to the counter and dropped it into the industrial trash bin beside the register. The hollow clang echoed through the quiet store. I did not buy another cheap replacement. I had commissioned a piece from a local artisan who specialized in mobility aids. He handed me a sleek, custom-crafted walking stick. It was carved from dense, polished ebony wood, capped with solid silver. The handle was perfectly molded to the grip of my hand. When I placed my weight on it, there was no squeak. There was only a solid, resonant thud against the floor. It did not look like a medical device. It looked like a scepter of absolute authority. I spent the next 3 days in Sarah's apartment practicing. I wore the emerald dress and held the ebony stick. I stood in front of the full-length mirror focusing on the mechanics of my posture. Without the heavy painkillers, the spasms in my lumbar spine were sharp and frequent, but I forced my muscles to engage. I lifted my chin. I squared my shoulders. I practiced walking not with a limp, but with a deliberate, measured cadence. I refused to let my father see me wince. I refused to let my sister see me shrink. On Friday afternoon, Marcus called me to his office for the final operational briefing. He handed me a thick, heavy manila envelope. It was sealed with red federal tamper-evident tape. "The indictments are unsealed, Anna," he said, his voice serious. "The federal warrants have been signed by a judge. Tomorrow night at 8 o'clock precisely during the reception dinner, the agents from the Office of the Inspector General will execute the arrests." He tapped the envelope. Inside are the civil asset seizure notices, the constructive trust documentation, the legal transfer of the commercial lease for core alignment, and the deed to your parents' primary residence. The U.S. Attorney's Office has authorized you to serve them civilly at the exact moment the criminal warrants are executed. I took the envelope, feeling the satisfying weight of justice in my hands. The paper felt heavier than the conservatorship petition. It carried the power of the federal government and the undeniable truth of a $250,000 theft. "Richard thinks he won," Marcus continued, leaning back in his chair. "He thinks the 14-day delay in family court was a victory. He is going to be surrounded by his wealthy friends, his business associates, the people he has lied to for years. The social humiliation will be total." I nodded, sliding the envelope into my structured clutch purse. "It is not just about humiliation, Marcus. and is about exposure. They built their entire identity on the illusion of sacrifice. Tomorrow night, everyone they know will see exactly who they sacrificed. Saturday arrived with a flawless coastal sunset, painting the San Diego sky in shades of bruised purple and gold. I dressed slowly, securing my hair into a sleek twist at the base of my neck. I applied my makeup with precise, steady hands. I slipped the emerald dress over my shoulders and picked up the ebony walking stick. Sarah drove me to the resort. The property sat on a cliff overlooking the Pacific Ocean, surrounded by manicured gardens and sweeping stone archways. The parking lot was filled with luxury sedans and valet attendants in crisp white uniforms. "Are you ready?" Sarah asked, shifting the car into park. I looked out the window at the glowing lights of the grand ballroom. I could hear the faint, elegant strains of a live string quartet drifting through the evening air. The stage was set, the audience was seated, the villains were celebrating their stolen success. "I am ready," I said. I opened the door and stepped out into the cool ocean breeze, my walking stick striking the pavement with a sharp, undeniable finality. The La Jolla Coastal Resort stood on a jagged cliff overlooking the Pacific Ocean. The rhythmic crash of the waves against the rocks below provided a steady baseline to the delicate music drifting from the grand ballroom. Valet attendants rushed to open the doors of luxury sedans and sports cars. Women draped in designer silk and men in custom tuxedos strolled up the illuminated stone pathway. I stood at the entrance, gripping my ebony walking stick, breathing in the crisp, salty air mixed with the cloying scent of expensive floral perfume. Every detail of this venue screamed affluent privilege. A towering archway of white orchids and imported roses framed the main doors. I knew the exact price of those flowers. I had memorized the federal ledgers and the wire transfers. Those orchids were purchased with my back pay. The cascading roses were funded by the monthly stipends meant for my pain management. The ice sculptures, the caviar stations, the endless flow of alcohol, all of it was tied to a routing number that belonged to me. I was not walking into a celebration of love. I was walking into a crime scene, decorated with buttercream and lace. I stepped inside the grand foyer. The emerald fabric of my gown swept across the polished marble floor. The solid silver cap of my walking stick struck the ground with a rhythmic, resonant sound. It was a stark, profound contrast to the squeaking, cheap aluminum I had dragged around for 6 years. I kept my chin elevated, my shoulders pulled back, and my spine rigidly straight. The physical effort sent sharp sparks of agony up my lower back, but I channeled the discomfort into sheer, unyielding focus. I refused to shrink today. A few heads turned as I passed the coat check. Distant relatives and family friends who had not seen me since the accident paused mid-sentence. They expected the tragic figure my father had spun tales about, the broken, dependent daughter shuffling in, wearing oversized sweatpants with a vacant stare. Their eyes widened, taking in the tailored dress and the confident posture. The hushed whispers started spreading through the crowd like a lit fuse. I ignored them and moved toward the glowing amber light of the reception hall. The reception space was breathtaking. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a warm glow over 100 round tables draped in crisp white linen. Waiters in tailored vests circulated with silver trays, offering flutes of vintage champagne and delicate appetizers. At the far end of the room, near a sprawling dance floor, stood the raised dais holding the head table. My parents were holding court near a towering structure of cascading champagne glasses. Susan wore a sophisticated navy couture gown. She was laughing, tossing her head back while accepting compliments from a group of wealthy country club wives. Richard stood beside her, swirling a glass of scotch, listening to a local politician. He beamed with the quiet pride of a generous patriarch who had spared no expense to give his youngest daughter a dream wedding. They soaked in the adoration, oblivious to the federal storm gathering right outside the resort doors. Beside the head table, Jessica posed for the photographer. She was draped in hand-stitched French lace, a custom bridal gown that easily cost more than my first year of intensive physical therapy. Her new husband, Chad, stood beside her, sporting a blinding white smile and a tailored tuxedo. He looked thrilled, entirely unaware that his perfect new life was financed by a $250,000 fraud. Jessica looked radiant. She was the golden child basking in the ultimate spotlight. I began my approach. The distance across the ballroom felt like a mile, but I paced myself. Every step was a calculated strike against the marble floor. The string quartet in the corner played a sweeping classical melody, providing a cinematic soundtrack to my march. Guests parted ways from me, stepping aside as if sensing the cold, sheer gravity of my presence. I did not look left or right. I kept my eyes locked on the head table. Richard spotted me when I was 20 feet away. The politician mid-joke noticed Richard's attention shift and followed his gaze. The color drained out of my father's tanned face in a rapid, sudden rush. His practiced, confident smile vanished, replaced by a rigid mask of panic. He quickly set his scotch glass down on a passing waiter's tray and muttered something sharp to Susan. My mother turned, her jaw tightening instantly. Richard stepped off the raised dais, moving quickly to intercept me before I reached the center of the room. He closed the distance, attempting to block my path. He reached out, aiming to grasp my elbow and steer me toward a dark corner near the service doors. I planted the rubber tip of my ebony stick and pivoted smoothly out of his reach. "Do not touch me," I said, my voice low, but carrying a razor-sharp edge. "Anna," he hissed, keeping his tone suppressed so the nearby tables would not hear. "What are you doing dressed like this? You are causing a spectacle. Go sit at table 42 in the back. There are important investors here, and you are embarrassing the family. Do not make a scene." I did not whisper back. I drew a deep breath, expanding my diaphragm, drawing on the vocal techniques I used to teach my young patients. I stepped around him, leaving him standing on the dance floor, and walked directly up to the edge of the head table. Susan had stopped laughing. Jessica turned away from the photographer, her smile freezing, as she saw me standing there, radiating cold authority. Chad looked confused, glancing between his new bride and the unfamiliar woman in the emerald gown. The string quartet finished their piece, leaving a brief, quiet lull in the ambient noise of the ballroom. I reached into my structured clutch purse. My fingers brushed the thick manila envelope sealed with red federal tamper-evident tape. I pulled it out, holding it up for a fraction of a second, so the stark official warnings printed on the front were visible. I dropped it directly onto the pristine white tablecloth right next to Jessica's crystal champagne flute. The heavy package landed with a loud, distinct thud that rattled the expensive silverware. I turned my head, looking directly at Richard, who had rushed up behind me. I did not raise my voice to a shout, but I spoke with a clear, ringing projection that cut through the remaining chatter of the room. "I just wanted to thank you, Dad," I said, "for investing my money so wisely." The words hung in the eucalyptus-scented air. The ripple effect was instantaneous. The elderly couple at the nearest table stopped talking. The groomsmen standing by the bar lowered their drinks. The silence spread outward in concentric circles, swallowing the background noise until the cavernous ballroom felt as quiet as a tomb. Susan stared at the red federal tape on the envelope as if a venomous snake had just slithered onto the table. Her manicured hands began to tremble. Jessica stepped forward, her face flushing a deep, angry crimson, ready to hurl an insult at me for ruining her perfect photo opportunity. Richard stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, his mind desperately trying to calculate how I possessed federal documents and what those documents meant for his immaculate reputation. He did not have time to formulate a lie. He did not have time to usher me away or spin a tale about my failing mental health. Because the state court delay had expired and the federal clock had just struck 0. The heavy manila envelope sat on the white tablecloth like an unexploded bomb. The red federal tamper-evident tape glowed under the crystal chandeliers. Jessica lunged forward, her manicured fingers hovering over the package. "Do not touch that, Anna," she snapped, her voice shrill and trembling. "You are ruining my reception. Security is going to throw you out." I did not flinch. I kept my posture rigid, my hands resting firmly on the silver cap of my walking stick. I turned my gaze from the golden child to my father. Richard was breathing shallowly, his eyes darting across the room, assessing the damage control needed to salvage the situation. "You do not need security, Jessica," I said, my projection clear enough to reach the surrounding tables. "You need a bankruptcy attorney, and you need a criminal defense lawyer." Susan let out a sharp, offended gasp. Richard took a threatening step toward me. "That is enough, Anna," he growled, dropping the polite facade entirely. "You are leaving right now. You are unwell and you are hallucinating." I shook my head slowly. "I am not hallucinating, Dad. I just spent the last 3 hours with the Office of the Inspector General." The acronym did not register with Jessica or Chad, but Richard's reaction was instantaneous. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving a grayish pallor. His jaw went slack. The confident, wealthy patriarch crumbled, exposing the terrified fraud underneath. I raised my voice slightly, addressing the silent crowd pressing in closer to the head table. "For 6 years, my father forged my signature on annual federal accounting reports. He claimed he spent thousands of dollars a month on specialized medical care for my spinal injury. Instead, he locked me in an uninsulated garage on a $50 allowance and used my Social Security disability money to fund this family." A murmur rippled through the guests. A man in a tuxedo 2 tables away set his drink down, staring at Richard in open shock. "That envelope, Jessica," I said, gesturing with my chin, "contains the civil asset seizure notices. The federal government traced the wire transfers. Your luxury Pilates studio, the reformer machines, the commercial lease, they were all funded directly by my stolen $45,000 back pay deposit. The U.S. Attorney's Office has frozen your business accounts. As of an hour ago, your studio is a crime scene." Jessica opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She looked at Chad, whose forced smile had transformed into a mask of pure horror. Chad was a junior banker. He understood the implications of frozen accounts and federal asset seizures. He physically took a step away from his new bride. "And Mom and Dad, I continued, turning back to my parents. "The forensic audit proved you used $150,000 of my federal money to pay off the remaining mortgage on your primary residence. You used $250,000 of stolen federal funds to buy your comfortable coastal life. And because you used a federal computer system to transfer those funds, you triggered federal wire fraud statutes." Susan swayed on her feet. The crystal champagne flute slipped from her grasp and shattered against the polished marble floor. The sharp crash echoed through the quiet ballroom, a harsh punctuation to the end of her pristine illusion. "This is a lie," Richard stammered, his voice cracking. He looked desperately at the surrounding guests. "She is medicated. She is paranoid. Do not listen to her." He did not finish his sentence. From the shadows near the service doors, 2 men in nondescript dark suits moved with deliberate, coordinated purpose. They did not rush. They walked across the dance floor, radiating an unmistakable, cold authority. They bypassed the security guards and the waitstaff, ignoring the murmurs of the crowd. They stopped directly behind Richard. The taller agent reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a leather wallet, flipping it open to display a silver badge. Richard George, the agent, stated, his voice flat and uncompromising. Richard turned slowly, his shoulders slumping as if an invisible weight had finally crushed him. The agent did not lower his voice. "I am Special Agent Miller with the Office of the Inspector General. We have a federal warrant for your arrest on charges of wire fraud, misapplication of fiduciary funds, and perjury." Susan let out a piercing scream. The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath that sucked the oxygen from the room. The second agent stepped toward my mother. "Susan George," he said, pulling a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. "You are also under arrest for conspiracy to commit federal wire fraud. Please place your hands behind your back." Susan backed away, tripping over the train of her couture gown. She collided with the tiered fondant wedding cake, sending the top layer crashing onto the floor. She burst into hysterical tears, begging Richard to do something. Richard stood paralyzed, staring blankly at the federal agents. The reality of the situation had finally breached his arrogance. Before the taller agent reached for Richard's wrists, I stepped forward. I leaned my weight on my ebony walking stick and pulled a thin, crisp white envelope from my clutch purse. It was not sealed with red tape. It was simple, elegant, and devastating. "Hold on," I said quietly, extending the envelope toward my father. "I have one final piece of paperwork." Richard looked at the envelope. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely grasp the paper. He tore the flap open. His eyes scanned the document. It was a legal notice drafted by Marcus, a constructive trust execution. I leaned in close enough so only Richard could hear my whisper over Susan's hysterical sobbing. "Because you used my stolen funds to pay off your mortgage. The court ruled that you purchased that asset for me. You do not own that house anymore, Dad. I do." I watched the realization hit him. The final, crushing blow. "You are right," I whispered, my voice steady and cold. "Housing expenses in California are brutal. You have 30 days to vacate my property." Richard crumpled. The stoic patriarch, the wealthy investor, the man who waived my physical therapy for cash, began to weep openly. The federal agent stepped forward, gripping Richard's arms and securing the steel cuffs around his wrists with a sharp, metallic click. Jessica shrieked a raw, guttural sound of pure rage and panic. She grabbed Chad by the lapels of his tuxedo, demanding he call a lawyer. Chad gently but firmly removed her hands from his jacket and took another step back, shaking his head. The string quartet had stopped playing long ago. The only sound in the grand ballroom was the clicking of the handcuffs and the rustle of the guests whispering to each other, watching the wealthy George family disintegrate. I stood tall, leaning on my custom ebony stick, and watched the federal agents march my parents out of the reception hall. The trap had sprung. The debt was collected. The grand ballroom emptied with breathtaking speed. Guests abandoned their half-eaten caviar and rushed toward the valet stand, leaving behind a sea of spilled champagne and shattered crystal. The social stigma attached to a federal arrest is swift, unforgiving, and contagious. Nobody wanted to be photographed near the head table. By Monday morning, Richard and Susan were no longer prominent figures in the affluent San Diego investment community. They were disgraced federal defendants. Marcus navigated the U.S. Attorney's Office with surgical precision. The prosecutors held an insurmountable mountain of evidence. They possessed the forged annual accounting ledgers, the traced wire transfers, the seized commercial leases, and the stark perjury transcript from the family court hearing. Facing decades in a federal penitentiary, my parents surrendered their remaining arrogance. They folded. Their expensive defense attorney negotiated a plea deal to keep them out of a concrete cell. The federal judge handed down a sentence of 5 years probation and an order of full financial restitution. They avoided wearing prison uniforms, but their comfortable coastal empire was decimated. The criminal conviction was merely the prologue to the true reckoning. Civil litigation provided the ultimate justice. Armed with the constructive trust ruling, Marcus initiated the formal transfer of assets. Because my stolen disability funds retired the mortgage, the property legally belonged to the victim. A Superior Court judge signed the decree transferring the deed of the sprawling 4-bedroom house directly into my name. I stood on the sidewalk outside that property on a crisp Tuesday morning. I wore my tailored emerald coat and leaned my weight on my ebony walking stick. 2 county sheriffs stood by the front door enforcing the 30-day eviction notice. Richard and Susan emerged from the house. The transformation was striking. They were stripped of their designer suits and diamond watches. The court had frozen their remaining accounts to satisfy the restitution order, leaving them with nothing but their physical possessions. They carried cardboard boxes and a few canvas duffel bags containing clothing and personal effects. Richard looked older. The commanding, authoritative patriarch was gone. His shoulders stooped, his jaw hung slack, and his eyes focused strictly on the pavement. He refused to look in my direction. Susan wept quietly, struggling to carry a heavy plastic bin filled with photo albums. Her manicured nails were chipped. The performative tears she used to manipulate judges and neighbors had turned into genuine, hollow sobs of defeat. They loaded their meager possessions into a cheap, rented sedan. Their luxury SUVs were gone, seized by the leasing companies days earlier after the automatic payments bounced. Richard started the engine, and they drove away from the pristine neighborhood they had prized so highly. They left me standing alone on the manicured driveway, holding the shiny brass keys to the front door. I unlocked the house and walked inside. The silence was profound. I did not walk into the master bedroom or the luxurious kitchen. I walked straight through the laundry room and opened the door to the detached garage. I stood in the center of the cold concrete floor. I breathed the stale, damp air, remembering the squeak of my old aluminum cane and the biting winter chills. I looked at the spot where my thin mattress used to lie. I knew with unwavering certainty that I would never sleep in a freezing box again. The justice system did not stop at the edge of my property line. The federal audit clearly documented the fraudulent origin of Jessica's business capital. Core Alignment was built entirely on a foundation of wire fraud. The U.S. Marshals arrived at the sleek La Jolla studio early on a Thursday morning. They bolted heavy iron padlocks onto the frosted glass doors and plastered bright orange seizure notices across the pristine windows. Jessica lost everything. The court ordered the immediate liquidation of the business assets to repay the $2,000 monthly stipends she had absorbed for 6 years. The imported reformer machines, the marble reception desk, the expensive retail inventory, all of it was scheduled for public auction. Her personal life mirrored her financial ruin. Chad, the junior investment banker, possessed a sharp, calculating mind for liability. He married a woman he believed was an affluent, successful entrepreneur with a pristine pedigree. Instead, he found himself legally tethered to an unemployed, broke individual deeply implicated in a federal conspiracy. They did not fly to Bora Bora for their honeymoon. Chad canceled the tickets the morning after the disastrous wedding reception, refusing to spend another dime. Jessica moved into a cramped one-bedroom apartment with a husband who barely spoke to her. The country club memberships evaporated. Her designer athletic wear was sold to luxury consignment shops to pay for groceries. I heard through former family acquaintances that their household was a bitter, resentful war zone. Chad blamed Jessica for the severe social humiliation that stalled his banking career. Jessica blamed Richard for getting caught and ruining her perfect trajectory. Neither of them ever acknowledged the actual victim of the crime. They were too busy mourning the loss of their stolen prestige to feel any remorse. The liquidation auction for Core Alignment was scheduled for the end of the month. Marcus sat in my new living room, sipping coffee and reviewing the thick asset forfeiture catalog. The state intended to sell the commercial lease and the Pilates equipment to the highest bidder, transferring the proceeds to my recovered accounts to satisfy the remaining restitution debt. I listened to Marcus detail the estimated value of the imported machines. He assumed I wanted the cash. He assumed I wanted to wipe my hands clean of the entire La Jolla operation and walk away with a sizable bank deposit to secure my future. But as I looked at the glossy catalog pages showing the spacious, sunlight-filled studio, a different vision materialized in my mind. The empty, airy room possessed immense potential. It featured wide doorways, non-slip flooring, and ample square footage. It was architecturally perfect for something far more meaningful than vanity fitness classes for wealthy socialites. I picked up my ebony walking stick and paced the length of the living room, feeling the steady, enduring strength in my recovering spine. I thought about the waived Medicare rehabilitation program. I thought about the specialized physical therapy my father explicitly denied me to keep the federal checks flowing. I thought about the countless patients throughout Southern California who struggled to find affordable, accessible care after severe trauma. The cash from the auction would sit in a bank account, gathering interest. But the physical space could generate actual, profound change. It could become the exact sanctuary I was denied. I turned to Marcus and placed my hand flat on the auction catalog. I asked him a question that made him set his coffee mug down in sheer surprise. The federal government was preparing to sell my sister's shattered dream to the highest bidder. But I realized I did not want the money. I wanted the keys to the kingdom. Marcus stared at me over the rim of his coffee mug. He had spent weeks negotiating the liquidation catalog with the federal prosecutors. He expected me to sign the authorization forms and walk away with a six-figure settlement. Now, I was telling him to cancel the public auction entirely. I did not want a cash transfer. I wanted the commercial lease. I wanted the imported reformer machines. I wanted the marble front desk. Marcus explained the intense logistical complexities of assuming a commercial tenancy seized by the government. It required mountains of state applications, federal waivers, and renegotiated insurance policies. We filed the necessary paperwork. The judge reviewed the origin of the funds and signed the order granting me total operational control of the property located on the prime coastal strip. A week later, I drove to La Jolla. The bright orange U.S. Marshal seizure notices were peeling in the salty ocean breeze. I peeled the stickers back, unlocked the heavy glass doors, and stepped inside. The air still carried the faint, lingering scent of eucalyptus and expensive citrus cleaner. The silence in the empty room was heavy and resonant. I walked up to the pristine white marble counter where Jessica had mocked my disability. I traced the smooth, cold stone surface with my fingertips, feeling the profound shift in power. I did not keep the vanity aesthetics. I hired a local contracting crew to strip the snobby exclusivity from the walls. They scraped the frosted privacy logos off the front windows, flooding the room with brilliant, unfiltered California sunlight. We tore out the expensive athletic wear retail displays and hauled them to the dumpster. The echoing sounds of power drills and hammers replaced the quiet hum of wealthy privilege. Jessica had purchased top-tier Pilates apparatuses for her high-end clients. What she did not realize is that the reformer machine was originally invented in a hospital ward to rehabilitate bedridden patients. I did not need to sell the equipment. I just needed to adapt it. I ordered specialized clinical modifications. Contractors bolted parallel walking bars directly into the hardwood floors. We installed ceiling track harnesses for secure gait training. We transformed a playground for the local elite into a medical sanctuary for the broken. My spine was slowly healing, but I still relied heavily on my ebony walking stick. I could not perform the strenuous physical labor of bearing a patient's body weight during a session. So I stepped into the role of clinical director. I posted job listings for licensed physical therapists. I did not hire fitness influencers or social media trainers. I hired hungry, fierce professionals. I interviewed young clinicians who possessed the same fiery advocacy I had when I fought for disabled children years ago. The real conflict emerged with the neighborhood zoning board and the local billing structure. La Jolla is a haven for premium concierge medicine. Establishing a clinic that accepted Medicare and low-income subsidies in that specific zip code was virtually unheard of. Local property managers raised their eyebrows at my business model. Financial advisors warned me the profit margins would ruin my operation within 6 months. I ignored their warnings. I possessed no mortgage debt, and the clinical equipment was already paid for in full. My overhead was incredibly low compared to neighboring facilities. I structured the billing department to prioritize accessibility over profit. If a trauma survivor needed intensive spinal rehabilitation but lacked premium insurance coverage, we found a grant or a subsidy to treat them anyway. I refused to let another human being decline medical recovery because of an arbitrary price tag, the way my father had done to me. 3 months after the federal arrests, the clinic opened its doors. We did not host a ribbon-cutting ceremony with oversized scissors and champagne. We simply unlocked the front entrance and welcomed our first appointment. His name was Mateo. He was a 19-year-old construction worker who had suffered a severe lumbar fracture from a scaffolding fall. His workers' compensation claim was stalled in endless bureaucracy, leaving him without vital care for months. He walked through the glass doors leaning heavily on a pair of metal crutches, his face tight with chronic pain. I watched my newly hired lead therapist guide Mateo onto one of the modified reformers. The padded carriage glided smoothly along the steel rails. The therapist adjusted the spring tension, providing gentle, supported resistance for Mateo's damaged back. Mateo closed his eyes and let out a long breath of pure relief. For the first time since his accident, his spine was safely supported while his core muscles engaged. I stood near the marble front desk, resting my hands on the silver cap of my walking stick. I watched Mateo work through his exercises. The memory of Jessica's voice echoed in my mind. "You are disabled, Anna. What were you going to do? Buy a nicer wheelchair?" I actually built a future. She was wrong. She built a fragile illusion funded by fraud and vanity. What I was watching in this sunlit room was an actual future. My stolen $45,000 back pay deposit was no longer a symbol of betrayal. It had metamorphosed into the very machinery providing a young man the chance to walk without agony. The money my parents hoarded to secure their own luxury retirement was now actively funding the recovery of dozens of local trauma survivors. The clinic grew rapidly. Word spread through the San Diego medical community about a state-of-the-art rehabilitation center offering high-quality care to underserved patients. My schedule filled with administrative duties, patient intake, assessments, and medical consultations. The physical toll of running a fast-paced healthcare facility tested my endurance daily. There were evenings I locked the glass doors and leaned against the wall, waiting for the burning spasms in my lower back to subside before I could walk to my car. But the exhaustion was fundamentally different now. It was not the hollow, suffocating fatigue of the uninsulated garage. It was the fulfilling, heavy weariness of a purpose-driven life. Every time I watched a patient transition from a wheelchair to a walker, or from a walker to independent steps, I felt a piece of my own trauma knit itself back together. I was healing my own psychological wounds by facilitating the physical healing of others. As the months passed, the rhythm of my new life settled into a steady, empowering cadence. The criminal justice system had processed my parents. The civil courts had redistributed their stolen empire to the rightful owner. My clinic was thriving beyond any financial projections the advisors had modeled. Yet the journey required one final moment of reflection to truly close the chapter. The transition from victim to victor was nearly complete, but I needed to acknowledge the physical and emotional summit I had finally reached. The California sun was setting on the darkest period of my life, and I was ready to face the dawn. The morning breeze rolling off the San Diego coast carries the distinct scent of salt water mixed with blooming jasmine. I am sitting on the back patio of a sprawling 4-bedroom house, holding a ceramic mug of dark roast coffee. The California sun is warm against my face, cutting through the early coastal chill. I trace the rim of the mug with my thumb, feeling the smooth glaze. I take a slow, measured sip. The coffee tastes rich and bitter. It tastes like freedom. It has been exactly 1 year since the federal agents walked into the grand ballroom of that La Jolla resort. 1 year since the steel handcuffs clicked shut around my father's wrists. 1 year since my sister watched her luxury empire shatter into 1,000 unrecoverable pieces. I look out across the manicured lawn. Just a few yards away stands a vibrant botanical garden filled with raised cedar planter beds. Rosemary bushes and tall stalks of purple lavender sway in the ocean breeze. This patch of earth is where the detached cinder block garage used to stand. The month after the county sheriffs enforced the eviction notice, I hired a local demolition crew. I stood on this very patio drinking coffee and watched a heavy excavator tear the uninsulated roof and the damp concrete walls into rubble. I watched the claw of the machine rip up the freezing floor where I spent 6 years shivering on a thin mattress. I did not leave a single brick intact. I replaced my former prison with living, breathing growth. The main house underwent a similar purge. I donated the heavy mahogany furniture and the expensive leather sofas to local charities. I hired contractors to widen the doorways and install subtle, discreet accessibility features throughout the hallways. I repainted the walls, replacing the sterile, imposing aesthetic my parents favored with warm, inviting tones. Richard's home office, the room that housed the locked filing cabinet and the forged federal documents, is now a sunlit library. The house no longer feels like a stolen monument to corporate greed. It feels like a sanctuary. It feels like mine. Managing my own life is a profound, quiet joy. Every afternoon, the mail carrier drops a stack of envelopes into the brass box by the front gate. I walk down the paved driveway, open the box, and retrieve my own letters. I review my own Social Security Administration statements. The federal government acknowledges me as a competent, independent adult. Nobody intercepts my correspondence. Nobody dictates my grocery budget or tallies the cost of my hot showers. Nobody hands me a crisp $50 bill on Sunday mornings and expects breathless gratitude. I balance the ledgers. I pay the property taxes. I write the checks. My physical recovery mirrors my financial independence. I attend therapy sessions 3 times a week at my own clinic in La Jolla. My lead clinicians push me hard, utilizing the exact, customized reformer machines funded by my stolen back pay. The agonizing, burning spasms in my lumbar spine have reduced to a manageable, dull ache. I still carry the custom ebony walking stick, but I no longer lean my full body weight onto the solid silver cap. Some days I leave the stick resting against the patio door while I water the lavender in the garden. I am slowly reclaiming the 60% mobility my father traded for a monthly wire transfer. I am doing it on my own terms, without the thick, suffocating fog of heavy narcotics. My mind is sharp. My body is healing. As for Richard and Susan, their current reality is stark. The terms of their federal plea deal require strict financial monitoring and monthly check-ins with a probation officer. They rent a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in an industrial zip code far away from their former country club friends. Their social exile is absolute. The affluent investors and local politicians they spent decades courting refuse to acknowledge their existence. Susan works as a part-time receptionist at a busy dental office, answering phones under harsh fluorescent lights. Richard bags groceries and retrieves shopping carts at a local supermarket to satisfy the minimum employment requirements of his probation. The authoritative, wealthy patriarch who once controlled my medical destiny now wears a polyester vest and asks customers if they prefer paper or plastic. Jessica faces her own desolate landscape. Chad filed for divorce citing irreconcilable differences the very week the federal asset seizures drained their joint checking accounts. Stripped of her turnkey luxury business and her golden child status, she lost the pristine coastal lifestyle she believed she was inherently owed. She works retail shifts at an outlet mall, folding sweaters and standing on her feet for 8 hours a day. The marble front desk, the designer athletic wear, the imported equipment are distant memories. She built her identity on my exploitation, and when the federal agents removed the foundation, her entire life collapsed. I heard these updates through the grapevine from former neighbors and distant relatives who reach out to me occasionally. I never seek the information out. I have never visited my parents' apartment. I have never walked into the outlet mall to see my sister. I have never answered the few desperate letters Susan sent, begging for financial assistance or a second chance. The door is closed and the lock is permanently turned. I feel no guilt over their circumstances. They constructed their own cages the moment they decided my broken spine was a lucrative investment opportunity. I set my coffee mug down on the patio table. The morning sun is climbing higher, illuminating the Pacific Ocean in the distance. The coastal fog has entirely burned away, leaving a pristine, clear sky. I am Annabella George. I am a survivor of a devastating accident, a pediatric physical therapist, a clinic director, and a homeowner. I am no longer a victim. If you are listening to my story right now and you recognize the signs, I want you to pay very close attention. Perhaps you are sitting in a room feeling like a burden. Perhaps someone you trust is managing your finances, your medical care, or your daily routine and telling you that you owe them your silence. Perhaps they are making you feel small, confused, or fragile so they can maintain their control. Do not let them convince you that your dependency is a permanent condition. Do not let them use the word family to justify their financial or emotional abuse. Love does not require you to surrender your autonomy. Caregiving does not come with an invoice attached to your basic human rights. You are allowed to ask questions. You are allowed to demand transparency. You are allowed to look at the bank statements, the medical records, and the legal filings. The people who genuinely care about your survival will never hide the ledger in a locked mahogany cabinet. They will never tell you that the cost of your existence is bankrupting their future. True family doesn't view your tragedy as a payday, and setting a boundary is sometimes the most powerful legal action you can take. You have the right to fight back. You have the right to gather your evidence, build your case, and tear down the illusions of the people who exploit you. It requires courage. It requires facing the terrifying reality that the people who raised you might be your greatest predators. But the moment you strike the match and burn their lies to the ground, you clear the path for your own truth to grow. If you've ever had a family member use your worst moment for their gain, how did you fight back? Drop a comment and hit subscribe. I read every single one. Thank you for listening to my story. Take a deep breath, square your shoulders, and go reclaim your life.
For as long as I can remember, the American dream has been sold to us as a package deal. A house with a yard, a stable career, and a family that has your back no matter what. It's a comforting image, one that promises safety and unconditional love. But what happens when the very people who are supposed to protect you become the architects of your destruction? What happens when the family home becomes a prison, and the people holding the keys are your own parents? The story of Annabella George is not just a tale of federal fraud and stolen assets. It is a profound, chilling exploration of what family means and what it costs. We grow up hearing that family is everything. It's a phrase stitched onto throw pillows and spoken over Thanksgiving dinners. It's meant to signify loyalty, a bond that transcends circumstance. But in Annabella's story, family is family became a weapon. It was the justification for a betrayal so deep it's hard to fathom. Her parents, Richard and Susan, didn't just steal $275,000 of her disability funds. They stole 6 years of her life. They stole her physical autonomy. And perhaps most devastatingly, they stole the very concept of parental love, replacing it with a calculated, cold-blooded business model. As a parent, the narrative forces a hard, uncomfortable look in the mirror. We are entrusted with the care of another human being, a responsibility that is meant to be sacred. The betrayal in this story wasn't just financial. It was a fundamental violation of the parental mandate. The detail that will forever haunt me is not the forged signatures or the secret accounts. It is the revelation that Richard explicitly declined a medical program that could have restored 60% of Annabella's mobility. Why? Because her recovery would have stopped the maximum tier checks. They literally traded her physical healing for cash. This is the ultimate cautionary tale about the corrosive nature of greed within a family. It serves as a stark reminder that children are not financial assets. They are not retirement plans. When a parent looks at their child and sees only a ledger, the family structure collapses. The George family's downfall wasn't just caused by their greed. It was accelerated by the toxic dynamic of favoritism. By funneling Annabella's stolen money into her sister Jessica's turnkey luxury business, Richard and Susan didn't just steal from one daughter, they poisoned the other, teaching her that success could be built on the suffering of her own flesh and blood. For young adults navigating their own independence, especially those facing physical or emotional vulnerabilities, Annabella's journey is a masterclass in reclaiming autonomy. She lived for 6 years in a manufactured reality, isolated in a drafty garage, believing her existence was bleeding them dry. Her mother kept her docile and compliant with heavy medication, masking psychological manipulation as maternal care. Her story teaches us a critical lesson: trust, but verify. Never feel guilty for asking to see the bank statements or the medical records. You have a right to transparency in your own life. When Annabella finally saw the truth, thanks to a sharp-eyed caseworker named Brenda. She didn't just break down. She funneled her rage into cold, iron resolve. She found allies, like the attorney Marcus, who helped her weaponize her truth. She proves that even when you are broken, you are not powerless. But this story also challenges our traditional cultural notions of family loyalty. In many cultures, respect for elders and loyalty to the family unit are paramount, often used to silence dissent and enforce compliance. Annabella's story redefines these values. Loyalty, she realizes, is a two-way street. Love does not require you to surrender your autonomy, she notes. True respect is earned through honesty and fairness, not demanded through manipulation and guilt. The narrative dismantles the myth of the burden, the idea that a disabled or dependent family member is a drain on resources. Annabella's parents successfully used this guilt to control her, a tactic that highlights the profound need to remove the stigma of disability so it cannot be used for exploitation. The most beautiful part of Annabella's story, however, is not the revenge or the asset seizure. It's the restorative justice she enacts. When she is awarded the commercial lease for her sister's Pilates studio, she doesn't sell it. Instead, she transforms a stolen monument to corporate greed into a sanctuary for others. She turns a vanity project funded by fraud into a low-cost physical therapy clinic for spinal injury survivors. She takes the very space bought with her stolen future and uses it to help others heal. It is the ultimate expression of turning trauma into service. Annabella's final words echo with a resonance that is hard to shake. Caregiving does not come with an invoice attached to your basic human rights. It's a statement that cuts through the lies and the manipulations, laying bare the core truth of what family should be. True family protects your future. They do not trade it for a monthly check. If you've found yourself nodding along to this story, if you've ever felt the sting of betrayal from those who were supposed to protect you, you are not alone. These stories matter because they shine a light into the dark corners we often try to ignore. If this resonated with you, I encourage you to follow the channel, Sophia Told Stories, for more narratives that challenge us, comfort us, and remind us of our own strength. We build our lives on the foundation of family, trusting that the ground beneath us is solid. We give them our keys, our vulnerability, and sometimes our very lives, believing they will keep us safe. But when the foundation cracks and we realize the walls were built with our own stolen bricks, what are we left with? Are we defined by the betrayals we suffer, or by the sanctuaries we build from the rubble? Perhaps the truest measure of a family isn't found in the blood we share, but in the truth we are willing to face when the doors are finally unlocked.